Hi, I'm Bill Arnold. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are many more podcasts available at myfaithradio.com. Your support makes this possible. Thank you.
Oh, don't you know, it's the Bill Arnold Show. It's Bill.
Welcome to the Bill Arnold Show. So glad you joined me today. I hope you had a chance to listen to Susie Larson live and maybe even Carmen this morning and all the programs that are going on at Faith Radio. It is a great place to be. I'm so excited about today, and I've got Dr. Don Bierle joining me in just a minute. I've got Dr. Gary Manning Jr. joining me in hour 2. That's going to be a great show. You know, Don Bierle had a 3-part series for me on creation theories and the biblical evidence for it. And I have to say, it has been fascinating. And today is the 3rd installment of our study on creation theories and the biblical evidence for it. He talked a little bit in the past about intelligent design and irreducible complexity. And of course, I had to go home and look up what that meant in the dictionary. So I'm learning new stuff all the time. And he's back for part 3 of our study on the biblical evidence for creation theories. Dr. Don Bierle is the founder of Faith Search International, and a couple of his books that he's written are prominent in my library. I love having him as a guest, and he's quite a teacher. Don, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks, Bill. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our final installment on creation and how it all began. This is a great study.
Yes. You know, Bill, I want to go back to the very first session and maybe clarify something, because I know you were a little bit taken back by my mentioning of the word nephesh applies to both people and animals, meaning that they have a soul. Remember that?
Oh, not only do I remember it, Don, I went ahead and continued to study it after you talked about it.
Well, I did some more research too, not wanting to mislead anybody. And the best that I can get is that it is true that the soul is used both for conscious animals as well as people. But because we were created different and special, we also have language capability. We also have a moral compass. Mm-hmm. And therefore, all the people I've been researching said, while the same word is used for both, they really are different. And so I hope that might help a little bit, that soul for humans and a soul for animals, they have in common only that they are both conscious beings. In other words, they know they're alive and they can respond to their environment. They can make, some along the way, some choices, but they're not the same.
Mm-hmm. I just listened yesterday to about a 30-minute sermon that Billy Graham taught on that very topic, and I found it fascinating. And
really?
Certainly God created animals, and he created them in a way that was very intentional. And Billy Graham went on to say that he just feels quite convinced that they have a future in the future kingdom. Just when we look at all the animals that are going to be in the new Jerusalem and the new heaven and the new earth,
yes,
it's good. It's exciting.
Yes, and it may be that rather than, people always ask me, is my pet cat, my pet dog going to be there in heaven? And I say, my best bet would be that no, they're not going to have eternal life. They're not going to be resurrected. But God's going to have even a better one for you in the new creation, because he says, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, nor has anyone imagined what God has prepared for those who love him. And I think most people think having some good animals would sure make it a lot more fun.
Yeah, I think God is very much in favor, though, of his creation of pets, and the fact that they seem to care about their owners, and the owners seem to certainly love the pets. I mean, that's something I think is a relationship God approves of. I think we learn a lot from pets.
I don't disagree.
Yeah.
I don't argue with you on that at all.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Uh,
I appreciate you bringing that up.
okay, yes. You know, uh, what we've talked about so far was meant, as God says in Ephesians or in Romans chapter 1, 18 through 20, it concludes there that anyone looking at creation uh, would have to observe that God's power and God's wisdom, that there is some power and there's wisdom behind it that cannot be explained other than by a very intelligent and powerful personal being. And there, it concludes, therefore, those who deny God are without excuse. And that's all I've done so far with creation, to be honest. And I wanted to make clear to your hearers, listeners, that uh, but all creation can help us with is to make that conclusion that I use the word that, T-H-A-T, that a being it must exist behind what we see in nature. If you want to know who that being is, you have to turn to God's additional activity in which he became flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. Then you have clearly the identity revealed of who the creator is. And there's no questions that can, at that point, no unknowns that are known. So not only does nature tell us, in other words, I like to tell people, nature points us to God. You have to go to Jesus to find salvation and the actual identity of the Creator.
Dr.
That
Don.
makes sense?
Yeah, it does. Dr. Don Bierle is my guest. And Don, as a scientist, I'm guessing you've never lost your sense of wonder over your decades of following Jesus.
As people say who do astronomy and they look through a telescope and see things in distance and on and on. And I did a lot of work in my graduate work in a microscope. And when you look through a telescope or a microscope, besides what you can see with the naked eye, you cannot help but sort of stand in awe at what you see. And that's my point exactly. People who do not see that are in mostly, I think, in denial. I don't want to be cruel, I don't want to be harsh, but many people are in denial of the evidence that God has provided to point us to Himself.
And Don, with how incredibly clear and crisp computers are nowadays, and some of the images that you can see on computers, you start to see the detail of God's creation in ways that maybe you couldn't quite see it. If you were on the Serengeti on a Jeep and you saw a lion in the distance, that's pretty spectacular. But to see the detail up close in high resolution on a computer, you go, wow, look at the marvel of this creation. It's spectacular.
Mhm. Scientists refer to that as high levels of order and specificity. You know, we talked about that in that second session, I think. You look for detail. Like I said, the detail on the presidents out in Mount Rushmore.
Right.
You can actually recognize who they are. That means they're detailed sufficiently, and therefore that points to an intelligent source. And all of nature cries out to us. This is impossible on the basis of any kind of chance that you would come up with this kind of order and this kind of specificity.
All right. Thank you for that, getting us started. Now, I would love to go on to part 3 of our the biblical evidence for creation theories.
Oh, well, let's can we back off first and do with the origin of life? I did have a few comments I'd like to make there if I could.
I'll give you one more backing off, and then that's it, Don.
the I want to contrast that several years ago, when I was still young, there was so much excitement that scientists were going to eventually create life in the laboratory. And they really believed it. Since that time, the enthusiasm has waned because it has basically come to a standstill. The idea that spontaneous generation chance could generate what we see in the universe and in biological life, etc., is now recognized that it's not going to happen. And so more and more scientists are actually acknowledging that some form of intelligence is required to come up with the DNA specificity for every living thing that's on the face of the earth. All of that points either to design intelligence, not to spontaneous generation. And so the way I like to say it is, which came first? Matter, the periodic chart of the elements, and then from that, it evolved into minds? Or did a mind exist first? And that created matter and all the detail that's made out of matter. And of course, my position is clearly with creation, mind was there first. So which is more logical? That you'd have start with a living being, life, in other words. You start with a personal being with intelligence and morality, and et cetera. And you start with, well, I guess life and intelligence and a personal being. Start there, or would you start with hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, etc., and expect to get persons, expect to get intelligent beings and like people, etc.? The logic of it, the intuitiveness of it is, of course, the easiest thing would be to start with a person, an intelligent and a powerful person, and therefore you could get persons, you can get life, etc., from that. And so that is only explaining what has already been discovered in the 19th century. Pasteur, Spallanzani, and a variety of other scientists came up with experiments in which they concluded the law of biogenesis. Life only comes from life. You cannot generate it from non-living matter. And that's a law in biological sciences. Of course, we explain that, well, but if you change the circumstances, you get rid of oxygen, you have a reducing atmosphere and all kinds of other circumstances, maybe then it could. Well, we've tried it and they've not been successful in that. And so I like to quote in that regard, the Philip Johnson. I don't know if you've heard of his book, Darwin on Trial.
I have heard of that.
Very, very influential guy. And he and I quote him, "At present, all discussions on principal theories and experiments in the field either end in a stalemate or in a confession of ignorance." And that's his explanation of where we are, trying to come up with the origin of life without God. George Wald, he's an older guy. I mean, he's dead for quite some time, but he won the Nobel Prize. He was considered kind of the father of evolution. And I love to quote what he said some long time ago, which is still apropos. When it comes to the origin of life on this earth, there are only two possibilities: creation or spontaneous generation. There's no third way. Spontaneous generation was disproved 150 years ago. But that leads us only to one other conclusion, that of supernatural creation. We cannot accept that on philosophical grounds. Therefore, we choose to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance. How telling is that?
Yeah. So if you do hold that position, there's probably a good chance you have hostility towards a creator God. Because I don't know who intellectually can sit and say, yeah, this just all happened out of one mindless explosion.
Yeah, you're right. Those who are already in a position where they deny the existence of God feel that the only explanation they're willing to accept is a naturalistic explanation, not a supernatural explanation.
Right.
Yeah. Francis Crick, the discoverer of DNA, he gave up so badly that he proposed what's called directed panspermia. Directed panspermia. What that simply means is an extraterrestrial civilization must have sent some primitive life forms like bacteria to the Earth in a spaceship.
Well, that makes sense. To
Well,
no one.
so that means I give up.
Yeah.
Let's come up with some bizarre explanation that makes no sense at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, without at least not without any evidence at all.
Yeah, I
Well,
thought
that's my extra comment about origin of life. We really have in the Bible the only viable explanation for the origin of life.
mhm. Here you take this Francis Crick, who I would assume is a very smart guy, but if you have a hostility towards God, you're going to come up with some theory that's going to sound a little crazy.
That's true. It's kind of, we call it grabbing for straws.
Okay.
You're trying to salvage something, and even though it's just out of the blue, there's no evidence and there's no basis for it whatsoever. But it simply means he has given up on trying to get life by chance.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's, I think you got a quote from George Wald as well.
Well, I did that one already.
Oh,
That was the one where he says, "We'll believe the impossible."
That's right. That's right. Okay. I'm just
Yeah.
looking at my clock going, I think I need to take a break. And I thought, well, maybe we have a little bit more
Okay.
time, but let's jump to a break. Dr. Don Bierle is my guest. We are enjoying part 3 of his study on creation and how it all began. If you have a question or comment, it's welcome at 877-933-2484. Welcome is a word said universally all over the world. Every language on the planet has their own way of making a friendly greeting. At Faith Radio, when we welcome, we really mean it. Learn more about us by requesting a free welcome pack gift. Text the word welcome to 877-933-2484 or visit myfaithradio.com to request your welcome pack today. And a warm welcome to you. My guest today is Dr. Don Bierle. We're talking about creation. It's a 3-part study. Today is the 3rd part as we are looking at how it all began. And Don, I'd love to jump into discussing some creation theories. I know there's a bunch out there.
Yes. And now we're talking about Christians, not unbelievers.
Okay.
And the conservative position is that Genesis talks about 6 24-hour days, 7 days with God's declaration that it was all very good and he rested, and also a young earth that is thousands of years old rather than millions or billions of years old. Now, that's a radical departure from where mainstream science is at. Well, many Christians feel the tension. How can they operate in the real world of science and acknowledge that the earth is only, 6,000 years old rather than billions? And so they try to accommodate long ages into the Bible. And that's what I mean by creation theories. One of those, for example, is very common to everyone, and much of mainline Christian churches hold to this one. That's theistic evolution. That is, I believe in God, but I also believe in evolution. And so I put the two together and I incorporate millions and millions of years into the creation process and simply acknowledge that God guided the process of evolution rather than it occurring by chance. Bill, the problem with that is that the minute you have God guiding the process, it's no longer evolution. No evolutionist would accept that God is the mechanism for evolution. They would say, no, that would totally destroy the whole idea that evolution is by chance. It's by mutation, natural selection operating on mutation. There's no finger of God involved in it, but that's the Christian view. And the second problem with theistic evolution is that you've got death and predation and uh, a horrible creation existing before humanity ever arrives on the scene. Therefore, you've got death occurring before sin. And the Bible is very clear that sin is the cause and the basis for the maladies we have in our lives and in the world. And so theistic evolution cannot explain that. That God says it was all very good. Really? After millions of years, and he suddenly puts humans on the planet now, and there's been death and horror going on for millions of years, and he says, "Oh, it's all really very good." It just, you see where I'm at? It does not fit.
I see where you're at.
And then, of course, most of the theistic evolutionists don't have a literal historical Adam and Eve. I mean, how could you? Because the humanity came out of lower forms of life. And even if you have God breathing into them a special morality or a special consciousness, you still have dumb brutes at the beginning, which is a total contrast to the creation that God made and talked about in Genesis, where they had communication skills, they had moral conscience, and on and on and on. So the whole theistic evolution idea is, for the only reason for it is to try to put in millions of years into the process of creation rather than 24-hour days and a young earth. So that's the motivation for theistic evolution. Same thing, of course, all the theories, that's the motivation.
Yeah.
The gap theory is a second one.
Okay, Doug, can we slow down just a sec? Because I feel like I've hit a bump here. When we look at the biblical record and we trace it back, we're going to, about 6,000 years back will be at the start of mankind, Adam and Eve. Is that correct?
Yes, if you use the genealogies, Genesis chapter 5, right, Genesis chapter 11, and so forth, you're going to arrive at somewhere in that neighborhood of 4,000 to 4,500 BC.
Okay. Now, with that, could God have created Adam and Eve and have them standing on rocks in the garden that were 3 billion years old? Can the age of the rocks be different than the age of humankind?
I would think that's a possibility. In other words, when Genesis 1:1 starts, what you're saying is before God started the creation, there must have been something there before that.
Yeah, he hovered over the deep and then did the separation. So what? There was something there that he separated. How long was it there? I understand that Adam and Eve might have been the start. What was the start of civilization? Maybe 6,000 years ago, but maybe the rocks on which they stood were billions of years old, because God could have done both.
That brings brings in a good point into the discussion. That is Genesis 1:1 part of the creation? In other words, there's some Bibles that said, in the beginning, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, assuming there was something else there before that. But every translator that I check that sees the inspiration of Scripture would say no. In the beginning means there was nothing prior to that time, and God brought in, verse 1 is really part of day one, in which he brought into existence space, time, matter, at that time. And therefore, in verse 2, it says, in the earth, and the people who think there's something before that, they'll translate it, and the earth became without form and void. That's I consider that a false translation. The earth was without form and void. In other words, God brought into existence space, matter, etc., but it had not yet been ordered. And the
Hmm.
whole chapter of 1 of Genesis is the Holy Spirit's activity in creating the universe, the world, the earth that we now live on, and people and all the animals and so forth. That's then no longer is it without form and void. And so that's what the whole point of the creation story is.
Hmm.
God preparing the earth, God bringing into existence the total creation. So I would say no, there was no rock that was there prior to Adam and Eve stepping down on the ground.
Okay. A comment just came in. In order for Genesis 1 to make sense and to be consistent, the rocks are also only about 6,000 years old. To your point, Don,
That's correct.
what would people say about, oh, I'm a Christian, but I'm an old earth advocate? What would you say to them?
Well, I would say, have you considered both the biblical and the external evidence? And if so, if we're going to come to a conclusion about that, it's going to take some study of the evidence one way or the other. So, in other words, it's not about, oh, Don prefers this view or he prefers that view. What does the evidence say? And God's position is in Romans 1:18 to 20 is if you look at the creation, you can't help but conclude that God exists. And if God exists, then he said, in the beginning, I created the heavens and the earth and everything on it, and even the beings. And it says in the Psalms, in Isaiah, and so forth. So, yeah, I would say, yeah, we're not opposed to honest discussion and honest debate.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm not telling these people they're nuts. I know they're trying hard. They want to preserve God and make him relevant to the lost world, and yet they think that evolution is true. My comment would be macroevolution, that is, amoebas to man, more and more is looking like a false teaching. It has just not been supported by the scientific data.
Hmm.
Hardliners still want to keep it, but it's not. And more scientists are moving away from Darwinian view.
Hmm. Another listener, Don, said, just trying to reconcile the date. Psalm 90, verse 4, 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the sky. And 2 Peter
Yes.
3:8, but do not forget this one thing, dear friends, with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day.
Keep in mind, every time you want to use a word, you better consider the context. Um, Day there in Peter is not the same as day in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 says, and there was morning and there was evening one day. Each time, there are, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 uses of day in the Old Testament.
Oh,
Every time that
mm-hmm,
it's marked by morning and evening, or it has a numeral with it, day one, day two, day three, 100% of the time it means 24 hours. When Peter is talking about it, he can say a million years is as a day to the Lord, because the Lord has omniscience. He knew everything that was going to happen in our universe before it ever happened, because he has perfect omniscience. But that's why a day can be a million years a day. But don't try to carry that over into Genesis 1 and make that be the basis you're going to have for saying, oh, days must be multiple years.
mm-hmm.
Um, I use the example of our English word trunk. If I said, bring your trunk along with you, am I talking about a suitcase? Am I talking about my elephant? Am I talking about my car?
Yeah,
Each case, in order to figure out what trunk means, I'd have to look at the context. Same thing with day.
yeah.
And by the way, in Genesis chapter 2, it actually uses day in a different way. It says, in the day that God created the heavens and the earth. Well, but the context clearly says it means in the time that God created the heavens and the earth. Like we would say, in my day. Well, I don't mean 24 hours. I mean years in my day. But so each time, context has to be considered.
Yeah, and if you had your own elephant, Don, we'd be better friends because I'd be want to
I
hang
know.
out. We got to go to Don's and hang out with this elephant. That'd be so fun.
Yeah.
All right, let me take a break. Dr. Don Bierle is my guest. If you have a question or comment, send it over 877-933-2484. We're talking about the biblical evidence for creation theories. Be right back. We're back with Dr. Don Bierle. We're talking today about creation theories, biblical evidence. This is part 3 of a study he's been nice enough to do. And before we jump on to talking about gap theory, Don, I've got a couple of other things that popped up on the text line. Another question. I believe in young earth, when God created Adam and Eve, he likely gave them adult bodies, even though they were age 1. They aren't infants to our knowledge. Can the earth have been created with an innate age when he brought everything into existence?
Could it? I don't think it could be any other way.
Yeah.
How can Jesus create wine from water and do it instantly? Anyone would say, well, that wine is aged. Otherwise, it wouldn't be wine.
Yeah, the best wine.
In other words, all creation assumes a maturity at the beginning. So that, yeah, Adam and Eve would have been adult communicators right from the get-go. And so in that sense, everything he created would have the appearance of age. And that could be an answer to why things, are. I mean, in other words, Adam and Eve didn't have to wait for carrots to grow in the garden before they could eat. They had seeds, they had fruit, and so forth already there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the maturity that creation generates right from the get-go.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, God creates them. They're going to probably need to have some nourishment of some kind, and that nourishment would need to be instantly available if that's the way God designed them.
I think that's true. That doesn't mean process couldn't also be a part, because it does appear at times that let the earth bring forth this and this and this,
Mm-hmm.
as if, well, that might take just a little time.
Sure.
But there's at other times you have instant. God speaks and it's there.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to another creation theory called gap theory. What is that? And how do we best understand it?
Yeah, try to keep that brief. The gap theory proposes that there were 2 creations, an ancient one and a recent one. And they're basing that on that same thing. Genesis 1:2, the earth became without form and void, and they propose that God created originally. We have no record of that at all, other than the fossil record. That would be from the original creation. And Satan rebelled and destroyed the first creation. So therefore it became without form and void. That's in reference to the first creation. Now, Genesis 1 describes the second or recent creation. And it's 24-hour days in 6 days, creation days. So they get their cake and eat it too. That is, the original creation took place over millions and millions of years, and animals evolved and the whole fossil record, and therefore we agree with evolution. But there was a second creation, which is the recent one, the one we're living in, and that was 24-hour days. That's how they reconcile getting millions of years and a recent earth.
Okay.
But does the Bible ever refer to 2 creations anywhere? In Exodus 20, verse 11, it says, in 6 days, God created the earth. Well, they'd say, well, that's true. That is the most recent one. And that's what it's referring to. And that's all that we have to do with. There's nothing in the Bible ever that Satan's rebellion had to do with the destruction of the creation. Nothing at all. And biologically, the fossils that we find in the sediments of the earth, see, they don't have the global flood then either, to put the fossils into the ground. That took place over millions of years, like evolutionists say. But the fossil record that we find in those layers of the earth are continuous with the animals that we find that are alive. And therefore, it looks like they're a continuity rather than two separate creations. So
Hmm.
those would be some of my responses to the gap theory.
Hmm. Another question, Don. What's the most important question regarding the age of Earth?
What's the most important?
Question regarding the age of Earth. If-
Um, I'm not sure what the question means, or what that's getting
yeah,
at.
if we're talking
Um,
about the age of the Earth, what would be
yeah.
probably the most relevant question we can ask regarding it? That would be
Well,
my
I would
guess.
think that we have to ask the question: was there such thing as a global flood?
Yeah.
Because that would be the alternate explanation for the layers of sediments that we find all over the earth. And the second thing would be probably um, is there um, is I'm trying to think, get it back together here. What was my second response? Let's continue. It'll come back to
Okay.
me.
No worries. Let's.
Um, so I think the global flood is the big. Oh, and I think now I remember the other way that people measure age is by the decay of elements. The how old is something? Well, you look at the decay of the elements, such as carbon 14, or you look at some of the ones that have longer age half-lives, and you look at that and say, is there any possibility that those rates of decay are not constant? And because those are the two ways, your sedimentary levels and your radioactive decay are the two ways you measure age. And if there are problems with either of those two, then you really don't have a case for the long periods of time.
Hmm.
Anyway, that's a thought.
Yeah, Don. I had a gentleman on from the Creation Research Society, and he was in Montana and was part of a dig, and they excavated a triceratops horn, and it had soft
Yes,
tissue in it. And
yes.
you go, well,
That
that's
that's it. That's the third fossil already that has been discovered with soft tissue
okay.
still in the bone. There was a one out in Faith, South Dakota, as well, that was found that had soft tissue in it. And soft tissue, most everybody would have to agree, shouldn't be there anymore, because the most recent fossils we would have of the triceratops or otherwise would be 65 million years ago. And you still have soft tissue like blood vessels and fibrous tissues and stuff like that still alive, or I shouldn't say alive, it's not decayed. And so yeah, that becomes an evidence against the long ages.
hmm We're talking to Don Bierle, and we're in a discussion on creation theories and the biblical evidence. And Don, let's talk about progressive creation.
Yeah, that's a third one. We had theistic evolution, gap theory, and then progressive creation is a group of Christians who have come to the agreement that Genesis chapter 1 does mean 6 24-hour days of creation. But in order to accommodate the millions of years of age that scientists say we're dealing with, they put millions of years between the days. So God does day one, 24 hours. Then millions of years go by. Then he does day two, and then millions of years go by. You see what I'm getting at?
Hmm.
That way, you have the days distributed over the millions and millions of years. But at that point, it just seems to me that there can be no ecological balance. You have to have pollinators for flowering plants, and they won't be around for another 100 million years. Uh, the whole idea of the balance of nature is absolutely gone in that theory. And they also have the same problems as theistic evolution. That is, you have waste and death preceding human existence and preceding sin. So death precedes sin in the progressive creation position too.
Mm-hmm. Don, we're going to take a break, but when I come back, I want to leave some space for you to talk about the strongest argument for creation. And I think everyone knows what that is. And we're excited to hear your teaching on what the New Testament says. And we're going to take a break and be right back with Dr. Don Bierle. If you have a question or comment, 877-933-2484.
Bill needs a minute. He needs a minute. Bill needs a minute. He'll be right back. He doesn't need an hour. He just needs a minute. And then another minute. And then he's back.
We carry each other's burdens. Please know you can bring us your prayer concerns and we will pray. Share your prayer requests with the Faith Radio team by texting or calling 877-933-2484 or share your prayer requests with the Faith Radio staff and listeners at myfaithradio.com.
Bill took a minute and now he's back.
I am back with Dr. Don Bierle. We're talking about the biblical evidence for creation, and Don has made these resources available. You can go check them out at faithsearchlearning.org. faithsearchlearning.org. There's free online learning resources, so head over there. He's done a wonderful job of preparing and putting this together. faithsearchlearning.org. All right, Don, let's move on to the exciting part for the strongest argument for creation.
Yeah. Well, I would say that's the biblical. Of course, if you don't believe in God, you probably don't believe in inspired scripture. And I understand that you're not going to be very impressed with what the Bible has to say. But for any person who takes seriously their faith, for example, you'll discover that there are over 100 references to Genesis chapters 1 through 11 in the New Testament. And in every one of those instances, the use of it assumes it is true and historical, both apostles and Jesus. For example, the apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 45 says, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. Well, evidently, if there was no first man, Adam, that God created, then it sort of looks that it would fault the last Adam too, which is, of course, Jesus Christ. Or Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3, but I'm afraid lest as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness. Was Paul quite uninformed? Did he not have any science background? Did he really thought those things were true? And again, my point is that the scripture assumes the historical truthfulness of the creation and the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Apostle John, not as Cain, who was of the evil one, he slew his brother. We're talking about Abel there. 1 John chapter 3, verse 12. And even the Apostle Peter warns us, he said, God did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah. He's talking about the global flood. He preserved Noah, and of course, including his family, when he brought a flood upon the world. So the Apostle Peter evidently believes that there was a global flood that was a judgment upon sin in the earth. But I suppose, Bill, it's even more powerful if Jesus starts talking about those things. And in Matthew 19:4, Jesus is quoted as saying, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? Yes. Or he refers in Matthew 24:37-38, for the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah, which were before the flood, until the day that Noah entered the ark. Once again, those who say the global flood is a farce, it never happened. would have to say Jesus, therefore, was uninformed and he is perpetuating untruth because he believed that there was an ark and he believed that there was a Noah and there was a flood. Um, and when we look at Revelation chapter 4, verse 11, this is now prophetic in the future. When all the believers kneel, worship before the throne of God in heaven, we're now there rather than here. It says we're going to sing a song. And what's the song? Worthy are you, our Lord and our God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and because of your will, they existed and were created. That's Revelation 4:11. There are numerous other ones. I use those just as an example of Jesus and the apostles that we revere and believe that they speak the truth. They clearly support creation, the global flood, and the instances of history in the book of Genesis.
Don, what about the people that question the existence of Adam and Eve? When you look at Luke chapter 3, in the genealogy of Jesus includes Adam.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, one of the genealogies goes back to Adam and Eve. The other one actually goes back to Abraham, if I'm not mistaken.
It does. That's Matthew 1.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's there. You can't have a high view of Scripture and not uh, believe in creation, the global flood, and the early origin of the people groups. I mean, not only that, in a Wednesday night class I'm teaching next week, we'll be talking about Babel, in which God confused the languages, and so that people would scatter all over the face of the earth. That was after the flood. And so that explains where all the languages, almost 7,000 languages that we have present in the peoples of the world. And so Genesis is all about beginnings. And I think it speaks truly. It speaks the truth about beginnings.
Mm-hmm. This topic, Old Earth, New Earth, is certainly quite divisive, not only among believers, but when believers talk to non-believers. They're written off as based on whatever position you take. It's quite divisive.
That's right. And I would point people to say, instead of fighting over it, why don't we just sit down and have a discussion? Let's bring, as God invites us, bring forth your reasons. God invites us, and I think this discussion should be like that. That is, if in fact you have an open mind, have you ever considered the arguments and evidence that's brought forth for a global flood? And many people who are of the scientific type, unbelief, they would say no, and I would just be below my dignity to even consider such a thing. That's their whole. So I'm just asking and appealing. Let's have an open mind. Let's talk and let's see what the evidence points to both ways,
Yeah,
one way or the other.
And if I could get you to come and bring your elephant, we could probably get a lot of attention.
Yeah. Hey, Bill, can I mention to people, I want to offer your listeners a free manual. I wrote a 60-page creation evolution manual for my seminars because I go around and teach seminars in churches and elsewhere. And if anyone would like to go to info@faithsearch.org, our corporate site, and simply give me your email, your name, and your address where we can send it. I'll send you a free 60-page manual called Making Sense of Creation and Evolution, if they would like to. Just send info@faithsearch.org and put it on there. You'd like to get that creation stuff, and we'll send it out.
Boy, is that ever a nice offer, Don. I appreciate all the work you've done and what you've put together and how you've presented it. You're a very accessible teacher. You lay it out very nicely.
Well, thank you. And then keep in mind that the faithsearchlearning.org, I'm putting all my videos, including Making Sense of Creation Evolution, free on the web, faithsearchlearning.org. And you can go there free observe any of the videos, study them, do whatever you want. And then all my articles I write in my newsletters about external evidence of archaeology, not just on creation, but other
Mhm.
subjects, is also being posted on
That-
that learning center.
That-
So
that's
make
awesome.
use of it.
Thank you. All right, we're going to take a little break and come back. Dr. Gary Manning Jr., we're going to talk about the fullness of the gospel. That's all next. Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.